There is a word so old it predates the alphabet we use to write it down. It comes from a language that was already ancient when Rome was a village, when Greece was a collection of goat farms on rocky hills, when the pyramids were so new the mortar was still drying. The word is berît. It is Hebrew, and it means covenant. But here is what your English translation does not tell you. The ancient world did not make a covenant. They did not sign one. They did not agree to one over a table. They cut one. To cut a berît was to take an animal, sometimes a goat, sometimes a bull, sometimes a bird, and split it down the middle. Two halves, laid on the ground, facing each other. And then the two parties to the agreement would walk between the pieces. The message was not subtle. If either of us breaks this, may what happened to this animal happen to us. Blood on the ground. The smell of iron in the air. This was how you made a promise in the ancient world. Not with ink. With death. Now, there is a God who has made 7 of these agreements with the human race. 7 covenants, in order. Stretching from the first garden to the Last Supper, from the first breath of the first man to the last words spoken on a Roman cross outside a city wall in Judea. And here is what I need you to understand before we look at a single one of them. One of these covenants, God made alone. No human partner stood across from him. No witness. No second signature. Just God, moving through the darkness, walking between the pieces of dead animals on the ground. Alone. We will get to that night. But not yet. Because to understand why that night matters, why it should stop you cold when you finally see it, you have to start at the beginning. The very beginning. Before the covenants were cut. Before the animals were split. Before there was blood on any ground at all. You have to start in a garden. His name was Adam. The text gives you almost nothing about what he looked like. Nothing about his height, the sound of his voice, whether he laughed easily or went quiet when he was thinking. The Bible is not interested in those details. What the Bible tells you is this: he was made from the ground. The Hebrew word is Adamah, earth, soil, red clay. His name and his origin are the same word. He was, in a very literal sense, a man made of the land he was asked to tend. God breathed into him. That is the text. Not poured, not installed. Breathed. The same word used for the wind moving across the surface of the water in Genesis 1. An intimacy that should be startling. The God who flung stars into orbit pressed his face close to a handful of clay and exhaled. And the man lived. The first covenant was not dramatic. There were no animals split in the dust. No fire. No smoke. It was a garden mandate. Tend this. Name these. Be fruitful. Multiply. The whole world is yours. One thing is not. You know how this ends. But before it ends, before the serpent, before the fruit, before the moment that fractures everything, there is a detail in Genesis 2 that most readers pass over without stopping. God looked at the man he had made and said something that he had not said once during all of creation. Every other day, God looked at what he had made and called it good. On this day, he looked at the man and said, "It is not good for him to be alone." Not good. In a world with no sin yet. In a garden with no death yet. In the presence of God himself. And it was still not good for the man to be alone. What does that tell you about what God built into the human soul from the very first breath? You were made for covenant. You were made for binding, permanent, costly love. It is not a religious impulse. It is not a cultural construct. It is written into the architecture of what you are, older than the fall, older than the law, older than any church building you have ever sat inside. Stay with me, because the garden does not stay peaceful. The serpent came. The woman ate. The man ate. And then came the sound. And this is one of the most devastating details in all of Scripture. The sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and the woman hid. The God who had breathed into clay. The God who had called the man not alone and made someone for him. The God who had given them everything. And they hid from the sound of his footsteps. What follows is the first covenant broken. The mandate shattered. The ground cursed. The garden closed. An angel with a flaming sword turning every direction at once, blocking the way back to the tree of life. But do not move past Genesis 3 verse 15 without stopping. Because inside the curse, inside the judgment, God says something to the serpent that does not sound like a curse at all. He says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Theologians have called this the proto-evangelium. The first gospel. The first announcement, buried inside a verdict of judgment. That something is coming that will undo what just happened here. There is an offspring. There is a crushing. There will be a heel that bleeds and a head that breaks. The first covenant is broken. But God has already announced the last one. The thread has been cut, and God has already picked up both ends. There is a number in Genesis that most people read past without realizing what it means. 120 years. That is how long Noah built the ark before a single drop of rain fell. 120 years of hammering gopher wood in a landlocked region where it had, according to some ancient Jewish sources, never rained at all. 120 years of neighbors watching. 120 years of being the man who believed something no one else believed. His full name in the Hebrew genealogy is Noach, and the text says something about him that it says about almost no one else in the entire Old Testament. Noah was righteous, blameless among the people of his time. He walked with God. That last phrase, walked with God, appears for only two people before the flood. Enoch, who walked with God and then was not, because God took him, and Noah, who walked with God while the rest of the world walked away. Here is what the world looked like when Noah was alive. Genesis 6 verse 5, one of the darkest verses in the Bible. God looked at the earth and saw that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil, all the time. Not occasionally, not mostly, every inclination, only evil, all the time. And then comes verse 6. And this is the verse that should stop you completely. It says God regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. The Hebrew word there is etzab. It means a grief so deep it causes physical pain. A word used for the agony of labor, for the ache of profound loss. God did not look at what humanity had become with cold divine indifference. He looked at it, and it hurt him. The same God who breathed into clay and said this is very good, looked at what that clay had chosen to become and grieved. Now watch what happens next. Because the flood is not primarily a story about water. It is not primarily a story about an ark or animals or 40 days of rain. It is a story about a God who was grieved to his core and still found one man worth saving. He found Noah, and he spoke to him. The instructions were precise. The dimensions of the ark in Genesis 6 have been analyzed by naval architects in the modern era, and the proportions, length to width to height, match the stability ratios of modern cargo vessels. 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. A vessel designed not for speed, not for navigation, but for survival, for floating, for enduring whatever came. Noah built it. For 120 years, he built it. And then the rain came. Genesis 7 verse 11 gives you a detail most people skip over in Sunday school. It was not just rain from above. The text says the fountains of the great deep burst open. The water came from below as well as above. The earth itself broke open. The ancient world did not experience a heavy downpour. It experienced a reversal of creation. The waters that God had separated on day 2 of Genesis 1 coming back together. The world unmade. For 40 days it rained. For 150 days the water prevailed. And then, slowly, impossibly, it began to recede. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah sent out a raven, then a dove. The dove came back with nothing. Then an olive branch. Then the dove did not come back at all. And Noah opened the door. Here is what I want you to feel in that moment. Not the relief, though the relief must have been enormous. Not the sight of dry ground, though after months of floating darkness that sight must have broken something open in his chest. I want you to feel the silence. After 120 years of building, after months of rain and darkness and the sound of water against wood, after everything the world had been was now gone, the silence of a new world with no footprints in it yet. Noah stepped out, and the first thing he did was build an altar. Not a house, not a shelter, an altar. And God smelled the offering and said, never again. The Noahic Covenant is the first covenant God makes with explicit, formal terms after the fall. And it is unlike every covenant that follows it in one staggering way. It is unconditional. God does not say, I will never flood the earth again if you obey me. He does not attach a condition. He does not build in an escape clause. He looks at Noah, this man who will be drunk and humiliated before the ink is dry on the covenant, metaphorically speaking. And he says, never again. Full stop. The sign is a rainbow. Now pay attention to this, because the Hebrew does something your English translation quietly loses. The word for rainbow in Genesis 9 is keshe, and keshe does not mean rainbow as a decoration in the sky. Keshe means a war bow, a weapon. The same word used in battle texts throughout the Old Testament. God hung his war bow in the clouds. Some scholars, and Josephus notes the rainbow's covenant significance in his Antiquities, have suggested the imagery is intentional. A warrior who has finished fighting hangs his bow, points it away, points it upward, the weapon aimed at heaven, not at earth. God is saying, if this covenant is ever broken, let the judgment fall on me. He is making a promise in the ancient Near Eastern way, with the threat of death built in, and he is pointing that threat at himself. You have seen this image before. You just didn't recognize it yet. But here is the thing about the Noahic Covenant that most people miss entirely. It is not made with Noah alone. Genesis 9 verses 9 to 10. God says, I am establishing my covenant with you, and with every living creature on earth. The birds, the livestock, every wild animal, every creature that came off that ark. God made a binding, blood oath level promise. With sparrows, with cattle, with creatures that cannot speak his name or understand what a covenant is. He made a promise to every breathing thing on the planet, whether they asked for it or not. That is not the action of a distant deity running the universe like an indifferent landlord. That is the action of a God who is catastrophically, irrationally, irreversibly committed to what he made. And we have not even gotten to Abraham yet. But before we leave Noah, before we leave the rainbow and the altar and the silence of a new world, I need you to hold one thought. Every covenant God makes in Scripture is a response to human failure. Adam fails. God responds with a promise and the curse. Humanity collapses into total corruption. God responds by starting over with one family and binding himself to never destroy the earth again. The pattern is already forming. Man breaks. God binds. Man falls apart. God cuts another covenant. And each covenant costs God something. Each one narrows the promise, makes it more specific, more costly, more personal. Each one is a step closer to the night in Genesis 15 that I told you about at the beginning. The night when God walked alone. We are almost there. His name was Abram. He was 75 years old. He lived in a city called Haran, in what is now southern Turkey. Having already left his hometown of Ur, one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the ancient world. Paved streets, a ziggurat, a thriving merchant class, running water. Abram had left all of that once already, following his father Terah north toward Canaan, before Terah stopped in Haran and died there. So Abram was already a man who had left one life behind. And then God spoke. Genesis 12 verse 1. For words in Hebrew that carry the weight of the entire Bible on their back. Lech lecha. Go. Leave. Get yourself out. No explanation. No map. No destination address. No arrival date. Just go. From your country, from your people, from your father's household, to the land I will show you. That phrase matters. Not to the land I will tell you about. Not to the land whose coordinates I am about to give you. To the land I will show you. Meaning, start walking. I will show you when you get there. God asked a 75-year-old man with a barren wife to leave everything he knew and walk toward a horizon he could not see, on the strength of a voice he could not prove. And Abram went. Here is the part nobody tells you about what happened next. It did not go smoothly. Abram arrived in Canaan and immediately left for Egypt because there was a famine. In Egypt, he told Pharaoh that his wife Sarai was his sister. Technically a half-truth, but functionally a lie designed to protect himself at her expense. Pharaoh took her into his household. God struck Pharaoh's house with plagues. Abram left Egypt wealthier than he arrived, which is either grace or irony or both. He came back to Canaan. He and his nephew Lot separated because their combined flocks were too large for the land to support. There were wars. Abram rescued Lot from a coalition of 4 kings. A mysterious priest king named Melchizedek appeared from nowhere, brought bread and wine, blessed Abram, and disappeared back into history. And then, years after the first promise, Abram went to God with a question that had been building in him like pressure behind a sealed door. Lord, you have promised me a land. You have promised me descendants like stars. But I have no child. My heir is a servant born in my household. What exactly are you going to give me? He was not being irreverent. He was being honest. He was a man who had walked away from everything on the strength of a promise, and the promise still had not arrived. And God took him outside, under the night sky of Canaan, and said, "Look up, count the stars, if you can count them. That is how many descendants you will have." Genesis 15 verse 6. One of the most important verses in the entire Bible. Abram believed God, and God credited it to him as righteousness. Not because Abram was perfect, not because he had earned it, not because his track record was clean, it wasn't. God credited righteousness to a man who simply believed that what God said was true. Paul will quote this verse in Romans. In Galatians, the author of Hebrews will quote it. James will quote it. This single sentence from a night under the Canaanite stars becomes the theological backbone of the entire New Testament's argument about faith. But the night is not over yet. And here is what most people miss. Abram asked a question, not about the descendants. He believed that part. He asked about the land. "Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?" It is a reasonable question. He is an old man. His wife is barren. The land is currently occupied by other nations. How do I know? And God answered him in the only way the ancient world knew how to make an unbreakable promise. He told Abram to bring animals. A heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, a pigeon. Abram brought them, cut them in half, all except the birds, laid the halves opposite each other on the ground. The cutting ceremony, the ancient blood oath. And then Abram waited. All day he waited, driving away the birds of prey that kept descending on the carcasses. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The smell of blood in the heat. And as the sun was setting, Genesis 15 verse 12 says, a thick and dreadful darkness came over Abram, and he fell into a deep sleep. Now we are at the night I told you about at the beginning, because here is what happened next. And I need you to understand what it means. In the ancient Near Eastern covenant ceremony, both parties walked between the pieces. Both parties made the oath. Both parties accepted the death consequence. If either breaks this, may what happened to these animals happen to us. Both. Together. That was the ritual. That was what every covenant ceremony in the ancient world looked like. But in Genesis 15, while Abram lay unconscious in the darkness, while he was literally incapable of walking, incapable of making any oath, incapable of accepting any consequence, something appeared between the animal pieces. A smoking fire pot, a blazing torch, and it passed between the pieces. Alone. God walked the covenant path. Alone. Both sides. God took both sides of the oath. God accepted both halves of the death consequence. If this covenant is ever broken by either party, let the death fall on me. Abram was asleep. He made no promise that night. He offered no commitment. He walked no path between the pieces. God cut this covenant with himself on behalf of a sleeping man who could not even stay awake to witness it. The smoking fire pot passed between the pieces in the dark, and God bound himself, unconditionally, irrevocably, at the cost of his own life, to a promise he made to a man who was unconscious. Do you see what kind of God this is? This is not a God who makes deals. This is not a God who negotiates from a position of power and extracts compliance in exchange for blessing. This is a God who walks between dead animals in the dark, alone, so that a sleeping man might one day have more descendants than there are stars in the sky. And here is what the rest of Genesis tells you. Abram, now renamed Abraham, will fail again. He will father a child with Hagar, his wife's servant, in an act of impatience that will fracture the Middle East for 4,000 years. He will lie about his wife a second time. He will laugh when God tells him Sarah will bear a son. The covenant holds anyway, because Abraham did not sign it. Abraham was asleep. God signed it. Alone. In the dark. The child came. Isaac, whose name means laughter, because Sarah laughed when the angel announced his birth, and laughed again when he was born, and said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. The boy who was the impossible promise made flesh. The boy who proved that God could do what biology said was finished. And then God asked for him back. Genesis 22. The binding of Isaac. Abraham took his son, his only son, the text says, the son he loved, up a mountain called Moriah, and raised a knife above him. And God stopped him. There in the thicket, a ram, caught by its horns. A substitute. The knife came down on the animal instead of the boy. And God said to Abraham, "Because you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. Through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed." All nations. Not just Abraham's family. Not just Israel. Every nation. Every people. Every language group on earth. Blessed through one man's willingness to trust a God, who walked between dead animals in the dark and signed a covenant alone. The Abrahamic Covenant is the hinge of the entire Bible. Every covenant before it points forward to it. Every covenant after it grows out of it. And somewhere in the grain of that wood on Mount Moriah, in the thicket where a ram waited with its horns caught, the shape of another sacrifice is beginning to form. But that is not yet. First comes the fire. 400 years passed. That is not a metaphor. That is not a poetic way of saying a long time. 400 years, roughly the distance from the founding of the first permanent English settlement in America to right now, passed between the last page of Genesis and the first page of Exodus. Abraham's descendants went into Egypt as a family of 70. They came out as a nation of 2 million. But they did not walk out free. They walked out through a sea that split open like a wound. They walked out with Egyptian jewelry on their wrists, payment for 400 years of unpaid labor, handed over in a single terrified night by a nation that just watched its firstborn sons die in their beds. They walked out behind a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, led by a God they were still learning to recognize. His name, the name he had given to Moses at the burning bush, was YHWH. For Hebrew consonants, no vowels, a name so sacred that Jewish tradition held it could not be spoken aloud. A name that many scholars believe is a form of the Hebrew verb to be. I am, I was, I will be. A name that is not a label but a statement of existence itself. This God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the fire pot in the dark, had heard the groaning of his people in slavery, had remembered his covenant, had come down, and now he was taking them somewhere. The destination was a mountain, Sinai, in the wilderness of the same name, a peak in the southern part of what is now the Sinai Peninsula. Those scholars have debated the exact location for centuries. What is not debated is what happened there. Exodus 19. The people arrived at the foot of the mountain, and God told Moses to prepare them. 3 days. Wash your clothes. Set a boundary around the mountain. Do not touch it. Anyone who touches it must be put to death. And on the 3rd day, this happened. There was thunder, lightning, a thick cloud over the mountain, the sound of a trumpet, growing louder and louder, the text says. Not fading, not stopping, but escalating, until the whole mountain trembled and everyone in the camp trembled with it. Moses led the people out to meet God, and the mountain was covered in smoke because God descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up like smoke from a furnace. This is not a gentle image. This is not a peaceful mountaintop sunrise. This is a holy God descending on a physical location with the full weight of his presence. And the physical world around it could not absorb that weight without shaking. And Moses went up. What came down from that mountain was the Mosaic Covenant, and it is the most structurally complex covenant in the entire Bible. George Mendenhall, a biblical scholar at the University of Michigan, published a landmark study in 1954, showing that the structure of the Sinai Covenant maps precisely onto Hittite suzerain vassal treaties from the 2nd millennium BC. The same era, the same region, the same legal architecture. A suzerain vassal treaty had 6 parts. Preamble, identifying the great king. Historical prologue, what the great king had already done for the lesser party. Stipulations, what the lesser party must now do. Deposit and reading, the document stored and read publicly. Witnesses, and blessings and curses. What happens if the treaty is kept? What happens if it is broken? Every single element appears in Exodus through Deuteronomy. God was not inventing a new form. He was speaking the legal language his people's world already understood. He was saying, I am your suzerain. I am your great king. And here is what I have already done for you. I brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now here is how we live together. The 10 Commandments were not the totality of the Mosaic Covenant. They were the preamble, the core principles. What followed was 613 commandments, laws governing worship, diet, property, marriage, criminal justice, agricultural practice, treatment of foreigners, treatment of the poor. an entire civilization handed down from a smoking mountain in the wilderness, and woven through all of it, this. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands, God will set you high above all nations. Blessed in the city and blessed in the country. Blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out. But, Deuteronomy 28 verse 15. If you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. What follows is one of the most harrowing passages in Scripture. 30 verses of specific, escalating curses. Confusion, defeat, disease, drought, madness, blindness. Your enemies will eat what you planted. Your children will be taken. You will be driven from the land, scattered among every nation, from one end of the earth to the other. This covenant was conditional, entirely conditional. Every covenant before it, Adamic, Noahic, Abrahamic, had either been unconditional or had been made by God alone, with the death consequence aimed at himself. But this one was different. This covenant put the weight on the people. Obey and live. Break it, and the curses come. And here is what the rest of the Old Testament is. The rest of the Old Testament is the story of Israel breaking it. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic moment of rebellion, though there were plenty of those. The golden calf at the very foot of Sinai, while Moses was still on the mountain receiving the law. The repeated cycles of the book of Judges, obedience, prosperity, forgetting, idolatry, oppression, crying out, rescue, repeat. The slow drift of the kings, the high places that never came down, the foreign gods that crept in through foreign marriages and foreign alliances, and the simple human tendency to worship whatever is visible over whatever is holy. Elijah stood alone on Mount Carmel and called fire down from heaven to prove that the God of Israel was real, and then collapsed under a juniper tree and asked God to let him die because he was the only one left who cared. He was not the only one left. God told him there were 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed the knee to Baal. But Elijah felt like the only one. And that feeling, the feeling of a remnant holding on in a nation that has walked away, runs like a grief thread through the entire middle of the Old Testament. The prophets came. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos. One after another after another. God sent voices into a nation that was careening toward the edge of the Deuteronomy 28 curses, warning them, pleading with them, sometimes weeping over them in language so raw it is almost unbearable to read. Hosea, whose own wife left him for other men, and whom God told to take her back, to buy her back, to love her again as a living parable of what God felt toward Israel. Hosea wrote this: "How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused." Hesed. That is the word underneath this passage. Covenant loyalty. The love that does not leave because of what a contract says. The love that does not leave because of what the lover is. Because of who the lover is. Because of what this God decided before any of this started about what kind of God he would be. The Mosaic Covenant was broken. Thoroughly. Repeatedly. Without recovery. In 722 BC, the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. The 10 tribes scattered. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon tore down Jerusalem, burned the temple, took the people into exile. The Ark of the Covenant disappeared from history. The holy city was rubble. Deuteronomy 28 had come true. Every word of it. The covenant was broken. The curses had arrived. And a people sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept, asking how they could sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. But here is what most people miss about this moment. The breaking of the Mosaic Covenant did not touch the Abrahamic Covenant. God had walked between those pieces alone. The death consequence was on him. Israel could shatter the Sinai Agreement into 1,000 pieces. And the promise made to Abraham under the stars, the promise sealed in the dark by a smoking fire pot moving alone. That promise did not require Israel's obedience to remain valid. It required only God's. And God had not moved. This is not a story about what Israel deserved. This is not a story about what any of us deserve. This is a story about a God whose covenant loyalty does not operate on the logic of what we have earned. It operates on the logic of what he promised. In the dark, alone, between the pieces, But even in the rubble of Jerusalem, even in the exile, even in the silence where the temple used to stand, God was not finished making covenants. There was still a shepherd, there was still a throne, and there was still a promise that had been made to a boy with a sling and a handful of stones. A promise that the whole broken history of Israel had not been able to cancel. His name was David. And before he was anything else, before he was king, before he was warrior, before he was the man God called a man after his own heart, he was the youngest son of a man named Jesse in a town called Bethlehem. He was the one nobody thought to call in from the fields. When the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse lined up 7 sons. 7. He brought them in one by one, tallest to shortest, most impressive to least. And God said no to every single one of them. Samuel looked at the oldest, Eliab, tall, strong, everything a king should look like from the outside, and thought, surely this is the one. And God said something to Samuel that has been quoted in sermons for 3,000 years and still has not lost its force. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Is there another son? Jesse almost seemed embarrassed. There is the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep. Go get him. David came in from the fields. Ruddy, bright-eyed, the text says, still smelling of the pasture. And God said to Samuel, rise and anoint him. This is the one. Samuel poured oil on the head of a shepherd boy in front of his family. And from that day forward, the text says, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. He went back to the sheep. Years passed before the crown actually came. Years of serving Saul, the king he would replace. Years of playing the harp to soothe a man who was slowly coming apart at the seams from the inside out. Years of a giant named Goliath and a sling and 5 smooth stones, and a battle won before anyone understood what kind of man this shepherd had become. Then Saul's paranoia, the spears thrown at David in the palace. The years as a fugitive, hiding in caves, leading a band of desperate men. Refusing twice to kill Saul when he had the chance because Saul was still God's anointed and David would not lift his hand against him. Then Saul died, and David was crowned, first over Judah, then, 7 years later, over all Israel. He captured Jerusalem, a city that had belonged to the Jebusites, unconquerable, sitting on a rocky spine between north and south, and made it his capital. He brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city, dancing before it in the streets with everything he had, until his wife Michal looked out the window and despised him for the undignified spectacle of it. David did not care. He was dancing before God. That was enough. And then David looked around at what he had built. He was sitting in a palace of cedar, the finest wood in the ancient world, imported from Lebanon, cut and shaped and fitted by craftsmen. A palace built for permanence. And the Ark of God, the presence of God, the covenant chest, the throne of the invisible king, was sitting in a tent. David said to the prophet Nathan, I am living in a house of cedar while the Ark of God remains in a tent. This is wrong. I want to build God a house. It was a generous impulse, a good impulse, and God said no. But the no came wrapped in something David did not expect. 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic Covenant, and it is one of the most quietly devastating passages in the Old Testament. Not because of what God refuses, but because of what God offers instead. God said to David through Nathan, you will not build me a house, but I will build you one. Not a cedar house, not a physical structure, a dynasty, a lineage, a house in the ancient sense, a family that continues, a name that endures, a throne that does not end. God said, when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Forever. Not for a generation, not for a dynasty. Forever. And then, and this is the line that should stop you, God said, I will be his father, and he will be my son. A human king, a son of God, an eternal throne. The immediate fulfillment was Solomon, David's son, who built the temple, who reigned in unparalleled splendor, who wrote wisdom literature that still shapes how the human race thinks about knowledge and fear and the shape of a good life. Solomon built the house, and then Solomon's kingdom split, and the dynasty wobbled, and the kings of David's line, some good, most not, ruled a shrinking, fracturing, increasingly faithless kingdom for 400 more years, until Nebuchadnezzar burned Jerusalem to the ground and the last Davidic king was taken in chains to Babylon. Here is where the Davidic Covenant should have ended. By every human calculation, it was finished. The throne was gone. The city was rubble. The line of David was in exile. The promise of an eternal kingdom looked like the wishful thinking of a dead civilization. And then Psalm 89 happened. Psalm 89 is one of the most brutally honest prayers in the entire Bible. It begins with praise. Your love stands firm forever. I will sing of your great love. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. 20 verses of soaring confidence in the Davidic Covenant. God's oath to David. His promise that the throne would last forever. And then, verse 38. But you have rejected and spurned. You have been very angry with your anointed one. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. The psalmist is not being polite. He is not softening the edges. He is standing in the ruins of Jerusalem and saying to God, you promised, and right now it does not look like you kept it. Where is your former great love, Lord? Where are all your faithful promises to David? Remember how all the nations mock us, how they mock every step of your anointed one. This is a man holding God to his word, in the ruins of the thing God promised to preserve forever, saying, I believe the promise. The evidence says the promise is broken. These two things cannot both be true. So which is it? And God did not answer that prayer in the psalmist's lifetime. He did not answer it for 600 more years. But the answer was coming. It had been coming since Genesis 3 verse 15. Since the night of the fire pot in Genesis 15. Since the ram in the thicket on Mount Moriah. The whole weight of every covenant, Adamic, Noahic, Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, was bending toward a single point in history like light through a lens. But before that point, before the answer arrived, one more prophet had to speak. One more covenant had to be announced. And it came not from a mountain, not from a palace, not from a burning bush or a vision in the night. It came from a man weeping in a pit. His name was Jeremiah, and he was the most reluctant prophet in the Bible. When God called him, Jeremiah said, I do not know how to speak. I am only a child. God touched his mouth and said, I have put my words in your mouth. And Jeremiah spent the next 40 years wishing he could give them back. He preached to a nation that would not listen. He warned of the Babylonian destruction while the official prophets told the king everything would be fine. He was thrown into a cistern, a dry well, the text says, with mud at the bottom, by officials who wanted him silenced. He sank into the mud. He was pulled out by a royal servant named Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian, who lowered rags and worn-out clothes on ropes for Jeremiah to put under his arms so the rope would not cut him. The man who would announce the new covenant was pulled out of a pit on a rope by a foreign servant using old rags. God does not always choose the obvious vessel. Jeremiah 31 verse 31. And here it is. After all of it, after the flood, after the stars, after the fire pot in the dark, after Sinai, after Babylon, after the ruins of Jerusalem, after 600 years of waiting for the answer to Psalm 89, here is what God said. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke that covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the only place in the entire Old Testament where God explicitly announces that a previous covenant is being replaced. Mosaic, gone, not abandoned, fulfilled, completed, honored, but replaced with something that solves the fundamental problem the Mosaic Covenant could never solve. What is the problem? The problem was never the law. The law was holy and good and right. Paul will say this in Romans, the law is spiritual. The problem was the people. The problem was the human heart that kept turning away, kept choosing the visible over the holy, kept breaking the covenant no matter how clearly the terms were written on stone. So God said, I am going to fix the heart. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. And then the line that carries the weight of everything that has come before it. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Not overlook, not tolerate, not manage. Forgive. Completely. Permanently. The sins of every broken covenant. The garden, the golden calf, the high places, the exile, remembered no more. But here is the question Jeremiah's announcement does not answer. How? How does a holy God forgive wickedness completely without the covenant death consequence being paid? The ancient logic of the berît is still in play. The cutting ceremony still demands that someone walk between the pieces. The oath still carries a death penalty. If the new covenant forgives everything, who pays? Jeremiah wrote the announcement. He did not live to see the answer. But 600 years later, in an upper room in Jerusalem, on the night before a Roman execution, a man took a cup of wine and said something that every person in that room would have recognized instantly as covenant language. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. The room was small. Borrowed, actually, a guest room on the upper floor of a house in Jerusalem, arranged through a conversation so cryptic that the disciples who secured it barely understood the instructions they were given. Follow a man carrying a water jar. An unusual sight, since water carrying was women's work, and he will lead you to the owner, and the owner will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. They followed the man. They found the room. They prepared the Passover. And Jesus came. 13 men around a low table. Bread, wine, the smell of roasted lamb. The same meal Israel had eaten on the night of the Exodus, the night the angel of death passed over every door marked with blood. The same meal that for 1400 years had been a remembrance of the night God pulled his people out of Egypt with an outstretched arm. The same meal. But this night, something was different. Jesus knew what was coming. The text is clear about this. He knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world, knew that Judas had already made his arrangement, knew that before the next night fell he would be dead. He knew all of it, and he sat down at the table anyway. He washed their feet, all of them, including the feet of the man who would betray him before sunrise. And then he took bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then he took the cup. And here is where every thread we have followed, from the garden to the flood, from the stars over Canaan to the smoking fire pot in the dark, from the foot of Sinai to the ruins of Jerusalem, from the shepherd boy dancing in the streets to the weeping prophet in the pit. Every single thread converges on these words. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. The new covenant, the one Jeremiah announced 600 years earlier, the one that would not be like the Mosaic Covenant. Because the Mosaic Covenant put the weight on human obedience, and human obedience always, eventually, collapsed. The new covenant, written not on stone but on hearts. Forgiveness not managed but completed. Sins not catalogued but remembered no more. And now Jesus was saying, that covenant, the one Jeremiah wept over in a pit, the one God announced in the ruins of everything Israel had broken, that covenant is being cut tonight with my blood. The cutting ceremony, the berît, the ancient logic that has run underneath every covenant since the beginning. Someone must walk between the pieces. Someone must absorb the death consequence. In Genesis 15, God walked alone in the dark, so that a sleeping man would not have to bear the oath he could not keep. The fire pot passed between the pieces and took both sides of the covenant death consequence on himself, because he knew, before Abraham's descendants existed, that they would break every covenant they were ever given. He knew, and he walked anyway. And now, in a Roman execution outside the walls of Jerusalem, the same God who walked between the pieces in the dark was walking between the pieces again. Not a smoking fire pot this time, not a blazing torch in the night. A man, 33 years old, carpenter's hands, a crown of thorns pressed into his skull, walking up a hill called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, carrying the instrument of his own execution. And the covenant death consequence, every broken promise, every shattered oath, every golden calf and high place and foreign god, every sin of every person who would ever live, came down. On him, not on Adam, not on Israel, not on you, on him. The God who signed the covenant alone in the dark paid the covenant price alone on a hill. Now watch what happens. Matthew 27 verse 51. The moment Jesus died, the curtain of the temple, the massive, thick curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the place where God's presence dwelled, the place only the high priest could enter once a year with blood, tore in two, from top to bottom. Not from the bottom up, as a man would tear it. From the top down. Something tore it from above. The barrier between God and humanity. The barrier the Mosaic Covenant had formalized. The barrier that said you cannot come in here. Without a priest and a sacrifice and blood, and a ritual so precise that one wrong step meant death, that barrier was gone. The new covenant was open. And 3 days later, because the story does not end on a hill, the man who had walked between the pieces walked out of a tomb. The Davidic Covenant, the promise of an eternal king on an eternal throne, the promise that had looked like wishful thinking in the ruins of Jerusalem. The promise that the psalmist had held up to God with shaking hands and demanded an answer for, was answered. Not a political king, not a military conqueror, a king who conquered the only enemy that had defeated every human being who ever lived. Death itself. The throne that God promised David would never end, it never ended. It simply moved from a palace in Jerusalem to a position above every name that can be named, in this age and in the age to come. Eusebius, writing in the 4th century in his ecclesiastical history, documents the explosion of the early church, communities of people across the Roman Empire, from Jerusalem to Rome to Ethiopia to India, all gathered around the claim that the new covenant was open, the price was paid, the king was alive. Within 3 centuries, the faith of 13 men in an upper room had reached every corner of the known world. Not by force, not by political power, by the announcement of a covenant. Come, it has been cut. The price has been paid. The barrier is gone. You do not need to be good enough. You do not need to have your history cleaned up. You do not need to come with a sacrifice. Because the sacrifice has been made. Once, the writer of Hebrews says, for all. This is not a religion of human effort trying to reach a distant God. This is not a system of rules designed to make you worthy of something you could earn if you tried hard enough. This is not a transaction where your performance determines your standing. This is a covenant, cut in blood, signed by God, alone. Here is what I want you to take from everything we have covered today. The first thing is this. Every covenant God made was initiated by him, not by us. Adam did not come to God and propose terms. Noah did not negotiate. Abraham was asleep. Israel did not volunteer for Sinai. They were brought there. David did not ask for an eternal throne. He asked to build a building, and God redirected him. Jeremiah did not design the new covenant. He announced it through tears in a language he barely understood. And you did not find God. The fire pot passed between the pieces long before you knew what a covenant was. If your relationship with God feels like something you are maintaining through your own performance, if it feels like a contract that depends on whether you showed up correctly this week, you have misread every covenant in this book. Every single one was God's move. Every single one was God walking toward a people who were moving away or asleep or in exile or in a pit. The initiative has always been his. It has never been yours. The second thing, every covenant was more costly to God than the one before it. The Noahic Covenant cost him grief beyond our understanding. The Abrahamic Covenant cost him a night alone in the dark with a death oath on his own name. The Mosaic Covenant cost him centuries of watching his people choose everything else. The Davidic Covenant cost him the agony of watching a dynasty he had promised to preserve collapse into rubble. And the new covenant, the final covenant, the one that fulfills and completes and answers every covenant before it, cost him everything. The God of the Bible is not a God who makes cheap promises. Every word he has spoken to the human race has been backed with his own life. The fire pot in the dark was not a symbol. It was a preview. The third thing, and this is the one I want you to carry with you. The thread from Genesis 3 verse 15 to the upper room to the empty tomb is unbroken. From the moment God looked at what had happened in the garden and embedded a promise inside the verdict, he will crush your head, you will strike his heel, to the moment the curtain tore from top to bottom. Not a single covenant God made was ever canceled by human failure. Not one. Men broke every covenant they were given. And God kept moving forward. God kept cutting new agreements. God kept finding ways to close the distance that human failure kept reopening. The proto-evangelium in Genesis 3. The rainbow in Genesis 9. The stars over Canaan in Genesis 15. The fire pot alone in the dark. the ram in the thicket, the voice on Sinai, the shepherd boy in the field, the weeping prophet in the pit, the upper room, the hill, the torn curtain, the empty tomb. One story, 7 covenants, one direction, toward you. The God who breathed into clay and called it very good has never stopped moving toward what he made. Not when the garden closed, not when the flood came, not when the exile happened, not when the temple burned, not when every human attempt at faithfulness collapsed into dust. He kept walking. He is still walking, and the covenant is still open. If you have never seriously considered what is being offered here, not a religion, not a set of rules, not a performance you have to maintain, then I want to invite you to sit with what we have covered today. Not to make a transaction, not to add a spiritual discipline to your routine, but to look at the God who walked between dead animals in the dark and signed a covenant alone so that a sleeping man could be called righteous. And ask yourself whether you actually know this God, whether the God you have believed in or rejected or ignored is actually this God, the God of the fire pot, the God of the rainbow, the God of the stars, the God of the torn curtain, because this God has been walking toward you since before you had a name. And the covenant he cut, alone, in the dark, at the cost of everything, is still standing. It has never been canceled. It never will be.